Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 85, which is going to be the start of a new and exciting series. Today we're going to begin a deep dive into the kingdom Animalia. And much like our exploration of animal physiology, our exploration of animal biodiversity will also be spread across two series, or two playlists. This first series will look specifically at the protostomes, and the next series will look at the deuterostomes. As you know, I like to arrange these things in accordance with the natural history, lining up with when these groups emerged and diverged throughout evolutionary time. So it should make sense then that the protostomes go first. Although within this series, things may be presented in a slightly scattered fashion. For example, today's episode will be about the world of worms, and instead of looking at any one particular branch on the protostome family tree, I'm going to be hopping all over the place, looking at multiple distinct branches that aren't necessarily very closely related. I'll explore them in the chronological evolutionary order in which they emerged, but just keep in mind that a lot of these groups may be rather distantly related, branching off of different larger branches on the protostome family tree. For today's episode, we'll be exploring all of the various protostomes that can be described as worms. Some of them are microscopic, while others are visible to the naked eye. Some are predators, while others are prey. Some will definitely fall into the strict taxonomical definition of a worm, while others will be pseudo-worms, or worm-like. For a lot of these more ambiguous cases, it's kind of a judgment call, so for the sake of satisfying our curiosity, I generally included as many worms and worm-like creatures as I could find. Taxonomically speaking, worm is an obsolete term. It was first used in a formal sense by the Swedish naturalist Linnaeus in the 18th century, and the French naturalist Lamarck in the 18th and early 19th centuries. They used the term to describe the vermes, which was a big bucket taxon of all of the invertebrate life forms that weren't arthropods. The vermes included all the corals, jellyfish, starfish, snails, slugs, barnacles, earthworms, leeches, and other parasitic worms, and a lot of other stuff. It was all just stuffed into this vermes bucket taxon of weird worm life forms that these 18th and 19th century European naturalists didn't have much information on. They were pretty ignorant to all these things. They didn't know any of the relationships, and so they just kind of threw everything together and said, that's where all the weird wiggly stuff goes. The word that they use to describe vermes is worm, and that word itself has an older usage, referring in Old English to any crawling creature, such that it included maggots, caterpillars, and even some amphibians and reptiles. So historically speaking, the term worm had a broad application that Linnaeus attempted to refine and formalize with the vermes taxon. It's clear to us today that the vermes taxon is deeply flawed. All of those organisms I listed aren't really that closely related to each other, certainly not monophyletically like this. Many of them also were clearly not worms, or at least not in the sense that we use the term today. There's no one walking around today who would look at a jellyfish, or a snail, or a starfish, and call it a worm. But to Linnaeus and Lamarck and their contemporaries, a lot of this work, this early organization of the slimy, soft-bodied invertebrates, was groundbreaking, as it represented some of the more comprehensive early forays into the taxonomy of what were considered really cryptic, largely mysterious life forms. Back in 18th century Europe, very little was known about these non-arthropod protostomes. Many species that we know today weren't even discovered yet, or understood in any meaningful way aside from morphological descriptions of a few specimens. Some of these species weren't even considered animals, but were instead thought to be some kind of strange plant, or a fungus, or like an intermediary form between an animal and a vegetable, some kind of primeval, archaic, evolutionary throwback. In modernity, the worms are a diverse and informal collection of long-bodied creatures that usually possess no limbs and no eyes. As we shall see, this seemingly tightly constrained definition of a worm includes a wide diversity of creatures in many different habitats that exhibit a broad range of behaviors and play distinct ecological roles. And all of this while retaining that classic worm-like body form. Now, with all of this being said, I'll begin our exploration of the world of worms with some of the oldest lineages, and as we go along, we'll visit increasingly modern lineages. So without any further ado, let's begin. Our exploration of the world of worms begins well over 600 or 700 or maybe even 800 million years ago, millions of years before protostomes and deuterostomes actually existed. At this point in time, the Earth had hosted life forms for billions of years, but these life forms were largely confined to just single-celled organisms. Multicellularity was actually a pretty recently emerged phenomenon, and the very few early animals that did exist were defined by their radial symmetry. These animals were neither protostomes nor deuterostomes. These were the sponges, and the hydra, and the jellyfish, relatively simple organisms that dominated the Ediacaran period, long before the Cambrian explosion. The first big divergence from this primordial status quo were the first worms, known collectively as the xenocoelomorphs. These worm-like organisms were also the first known animals to evolve bilateral symmetry. This was a radical break from the radial symmetry of the sponges and the jellyfish, as bilateral symmetry provided an entirely new anatomy, a new physiological platform for evolution to play with. The big changes to keep in mind here are that bilateral symmetry also created a front and a back, and having a front end which faced the direction that the body was moving into the environment in the direction of travel, this led to the evolution of cephalization, or the evolution of a head. It also created a unidirectional digestive tract with two separate orifices, one for food to be put into the body, or a mouth, and the other for waste to be removed from the body, or an anus. The most fundamental, basic, bilaterally symmetrical body structure is a simple cylinder with a head on one end, an anus on the other, and a digestive tract and assorted organs in between. At its most basic, this is a worm, or a worm-like shape. The most important thing for today's episode is that these first known bilateral lineages belong to the Xenocoelomorpha clade, which includes the Acoelomorpha and the Xenoturbella genera. Speaking of the acoelomorphs, you might also remember from earlier episodes that the coelom is like an internal cavity, either fully or partially enclosed by mesoderm tissue. It's where most of the internal organs are contained. But some of these very early worm-like organisms actually didn't have coeloms. These acoelomates have no internal cavity. Their organs are small and embedded directly in the mesoderm. This acoelomorph lineage includes animals that are small and soft-bodied and so primitive that they don't have a circulatory or a respiratory system. They don't have a developed gut, and many of them don't even have an anus. They eject waste out of the same orifice they eat through. They have simple linear nerve tracts that form a ring structure near the head, but this is not a true brain. It's more like an evolutionary relic, a throwback to the evolutionary origins of the true brains. Now, we have brains, other mammals have true brains, other vertebrates have true brains, but a million generations ago, give or take a few 100,000, maybe I'm off by an order of magnitude here, maybe a billion generations ago, give or take a few million, our ancestors would have had simple, rudimentary pseudo-brains like this protostome. These acoelomorphs are primitive in many other ways. For example, they don't have well-developed senses. They do possess a staticist, which helps them maintain their balance and orientation in the watery, three-dimensional environment in which they live. Some species even have cells equipped with a basic pigment, which allows them to detect light, although this isn't really sight as we understand it. The acoelomorphs can detect the general direction of a light source, like the sun in the sky, but that's about it. This is the extent of their ability to sense the world. The Xenoturbella are another group within the Xenocoelomorpha, and they're just as primitive as their coelom-lacking cousins. They also lack a true gut and a full digestive system. They lack a circulatory and a respiratory system. They only have the two senses, the statocyst for balance, and some pigmented cells for basic light detection. Their nervous system is actually even less developed than the acoelomorphs. Where the acoelomorphs possess linear nerve tracts and a ring-like pseudo-brain, the Xenoturbella don't even have that. They have a diffused, non-centralized neural net, much like their ancient hydra and jellyfish cousins. In fact, the Xenoturbella don't even have mouths, and they don't seem to eat anything. They're so small and simple that they effectively absorb ambient nutrients right into their tissues. The Xenoturbella are basically like small flakes of organic material that squirm with the power of life, growing to a maximum size of 4 centimeters. Now, I should clarify that this group, the Xenocoelomorpha, is not actually a protostome group. I think I described a proto-protostome group, but in fact, it's kind of neither. The Xenocoelomorpha is a sister clade to another clade called the... In fact, it's neither. The Xenocoelomorpha is a sister clade to the Nephrozoa, which includes all of the true protostomes and deuterostomes. So the Nephrozoa would be the proto-protostomes, as it produced the protostomes and the deuterostomes and all of the groups and subclades and whatnot within them. Now, the reason that I started here with the Xenocoelomorpha is to demonstrate just how basal and fundamental the worm body form is. It's literally just a step or two above sponges. It's so basic that it predates the protostomes and deuterostomes, and it laid the groundwork, the evolutionary physiological groundwork, the infrastructure, the architecture, for all bilaterally symmetrical animals to come after them, all of the protostomes and all of the deuterostomes for the next 6, 7, 800 million years, right up to the modern day, including you and me and every other human being on the planet. Alright, so with that said, let's actually get to the subject of today's episode. The Nephrozoa diverged very roughly around 700 million years ago, and the protostomes themselves emerged around 610 million years ago. And over the next few million years, this newly formed protostome lineage would diverge into two major groups, the Spiralia and the Ecdysozoa. The Spiralia diverged first, and would produce groups like the annelids, the flatworms, the rotifers, and the mollusks. The Ecdysozoa would produce a wide variety of worm-like organisms as well, before eventually generating tardigrades and arthropods like insects, arachnids, and crustaceans. Ecdysozoa is characterized by the species regularly molting its outermost layer of skin, or its cuticle, or exoskeleton, if you will. I'm going to explore the biology and biodiversity of all of these groups in due time, but for now, let's stay focused on the worms, and start here with those in the Spiralia clade, as these worm lineages are generally older and more basal than any others. One of the oldest and most widespread protostome Spiralia lineages are the rotifers. The rotifers are a wildly diverse and cosmopolitan group, with more than 2,000 described species. They are a clade that has adapted to virtually every habitat and every microbiological niche, be it the ocean, the soil, or the body of a host. Some of them are quite small, barely a few times larger than bacterial cells, while others are relatively large, growing to be a beefy 2 millimeters long. Some are free-living organisms, with free-living aquatic rotifers being included in the ranks of the plankton, while other rotifers are limited to crawling around through some kind of substrate, like mud, or silt, or soil, while others still are completely immobile and live anchored to the ground, or to some other host of some kind. Anatomically, the rotifers take the form of soft, squishy tubes, able to contract into a globular or spheroid shape, or to elongate themselves into a much more cylindrical, almost thread or fiber-like form. Unlike their primitive xenocoelomorph cousins, the rotifers possess developed internal organs and body systems. They have a full digestive system that includes a stomach with acid, a bit of intestine, a bladder, and a cloaca where waste is removed, and they also have nerve tracts running through the body, with a small brain, a true brain, mounted in the head. The defining anatomical features of the rotifers are their heavily ciliated head and mouth. The cilia are like little hairs which can wave around in the water, creating tiny microcurrents that the rotifers use to pull in food particles to their mouths for ingestion. Carnivorous rotifer species additionally have little calcified structures that act like forceps, or like tiny jaws that can chew on prey and break down large food chunks, like if they're eating algae, for example. In the simplest species, the cilia form a simple ring around the mouth, where they can gently lap up food particles. But in the more complex species, the ciliated tissue extends across the head, and sometimes over the entire body, where the cilia can then help with general movement through the water, or through the substrate. The rotifers are of immense ecological importance, because even though each individual is tiny and has a very small individual contribution, they are countless in number. Their raw biomass saturates the environment, be it ocean, sediment, or dirt, and so the rotifers make up a huge part of the diet of many species. Rotifers are a major food source for bryozoa, jellyfish, starfish, and various crustaceans, among others. They are a part of the base of the food chain, and everything above them depends on them in some small way. Closely related to the rotifers are the Chitognatha, or the arrow worms. Like the rotifers, these small aquatic organisms have a worldwide distribution, and are considered to be part of the plankton in ocean environments. Now, a real quick aside, just to clarify, the plankton are small aquatic organisms that are too weak to swim against the current. So in effect, the plankton are small ambient particles of organic matter that saturate the ocean, being pushed about by waves and currents, and being consumed by all manner of larger creatures. And if you were to look at these plankton under a microscope, you would see that they're these tiny little worms covered in hairs and cilia and all sorts of antennae, and they take all manner of forms. They have endless diversity and variety. It's really amazing. About a fifth of the Chitognatha live on the sea floor, where they scavenge for detritus and they feed off of the marine snow falling from near the surface. They represent some of the smaller organisms that come to feed on a whale fall. The Chitognatha are all carnivores with torpedo or arrow-shaped bodies, and some of them even have small pseudo-fins that help them to swim short distances or surge through the water. At their front is a head lined with multiple hooked spines that grasp at prey to grab it and trap it and feed it into the mouth. This leads into a simple lubricated digestive tract lined with cilia, which pushes the food along as it gets digested. So the Chitognatha have cilia inside and outside. The waste is excreted in two forms, either directly through the anus, or it gets dissolved into small particles that are secreted through the skin. The nervous system is simple, with a ring of neural ganglia and trailing fibers that innervate the missile-shaped body. Some neurons feed into sensory bristles along the head, neck, and back that can sense pressure and movement in the water. Other neurons connect to the two compound eyes they use to detect light. Both the rotifers and the Chitognatha belong to the Gnathifera clade, which diverged about 580 million years ago from the Platytrochozoa clade. The Platytrochozoa includes much more recognizable worm groups, like the flatworms and the annelids, which you might better know as the earthworms. The Platytrochozoa group also includes the mollusks, but I'll be exploring them in more detail in the next episode. For now, let's turn our focus to the flatworms and the annelids. The flatworms are unsegmented, soft-bodied coelomates, which means, just like the xenocoelomorphs, the flatworms don't have an internal body cavity. Additionally, they don't have circulatory systems or respiratory organs, and they rely entirely on diffusion to move nutrients through their bodies. Despite this severe limitation, some flatworms can actually become relatively large. Like the parasitic flatworms, they grow to be many centimeters or even several meters long inside the guts of their host animal. In contrast to the xenocoelomorphs, the flatworms do possess a complete digestive system, with specific structures for breaking down food and for isolating and removing waste. Curiously, there's a lot of internal diversity within the flatworms about their digestive systems. Some species don't have an anus at all, but instead will regurgitate waste out of their mouth. Other species, like those really large parasitic flatworms that can invade the guts of host animals and grow through their intestinal tract, these larger flatworms typically have one anus at the opposite end of their body from their mouth, and this is more traditional with a lot of other bilaterally symmetrical animals. But other species of flatworms, like larger flatworms that have a more broad body shape and a highly branching digestive system, can have multiple anuses protruding from different points along their body. Because of their utter dependence on diffusion, their guts often branch out throughout the body, supplying all of their tissues as best as possible. If you recently listened to my episode on fungal physiology, then you should know that this high surface area for diffusion is a double-edged sword. It also allows water and nutrients to leave the organism easily, so flatworms are ecologically confined to wet habitats, like oceans, lakes, and the mud or riparian soil next to a river, or the leaf litter on a forest floor, or in the digestive tract or the bloodstream of a host animal. If you got the impression that these flatworms were a really diverse group, you'd be correct. Among them, there are various groups like the turbellarians, which are generally larger and brightly colored, like the Pseudoceros dimidiatus, or species that are small and semi-transparent, like all of the planarians. Speaking more generally, the flatworms are overwhelmingly hermaphroditic. In the larger turbellarians, they have one or more penises, which they use like weapons to fight with other individuals. The first one to stab the other with the penis gets to impregnate them, and the stabbed individual who receives the sperm will then develop and release the eggs. Other flatworms are parasites, like the Aspidogastria or the Digenia, which use one or more suckers to attach to the inner gut lining of their fish, turtle, or gastropod host. Other groups, like the Monogenea, have suckers or hooks near their tail end, which attach to their host. They then eat the skin and/or mucus, or dissolve through the skin to feed on the blood and softer tissues inside the host's body. And then there's the Cestoda, or the tapeworms, which have no mouth or guts, but instead absorb food directly through their skin. Because of this unique and particularly strange physiology, they almost exclusively inhabit the guts of larger animals and parasitize nutrients directly out of the host's own ingested food supply. These tapeworms are really gnarly. The Taenia genus, for example, lay their eggs on grasses and leaves, which are then consumed by grazing herbivores. Inside of the herbivore, the eggs hatch, and the worms migrate into the muscle tissue, where they can be passed on into carnivores like cats, dogs, and humans, basically any carnivorous animal that has eaten this herbivorous prey animal. Once the carnivore has consumed the infected flesh, the tapeworm will pop out of the bolus and attach to the inner lining of the digestive tract. As the tapeworm's metabolism is really inefficient, it has to absorb a disproportionately large quantity of nutrients to get what it needs to survive, which can end up starving and hurting their host. Okay, the last group of worms that I want to talk about in the Spiralia division are the annelids, also known as the ringed worms or the segmented worms. This phylum includes more than 22,000 species, some very recognizable, like the earthworms and the leeches, and others that are relatively strange and exotic, like sabalids and lemmilobrachians. Naturally, with such a diverse clade, there's going to be way too many differences and details to go into them all, so I'll try to the best of my ability to cover the generalities, the big characteristics that most of these annelids share, or the set of characteristics that are distinctive to them. Like other segmented creatures, the annelids have a body form composed of repeating units, each unit equipped with a set of organs and a pair of limbs or appendages, often legs or pseudo-legs, that are used for locomotion. Some species have true vasculature, and near the head region some of these veins are lined with muscles that act like a primitive heart. Other species don't have these pseudo-heart muscles, or even veins at all, and instead their bodies are literally just long, squishy cylinders filled with fluid. In these species, blood is circulated with the same peristaltic mechanism that the annelids use to move. While many of them have parapodia, or little feet-like structures that can drag them or push them through the substrate, most annelids rely primarily on peristalsis to get around. This is a really cool mechanism. Individual segments can expand or contract, creating bulges or narrowed sections of the body. By bulging out one segment after another in a continuous, sequential fashion, a bulge of fluid-expanded tissue can slide down the length of the worm. Multiple bulges can be sent down the body at once, and together they push against the substrate, propelling the worm forward. Each body segment contains mucus-secreting glands, a bladder, nephrostomes, metanephridium, and nephritiopores for removing nitrogenous wastes. While a single gut, a single circulatory system, and a single nervous system runs through the entire body. A ring of neural ganglia exists in the head, although in some species the brain is more centralized, with a distinct singular mass with an apparent forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain division. Nerve cords run down the length of either side of the annelid's body, connecting across the middle with neural bridges that give the entire neural system a ladder-like appearance. Heavy innervation of each segment's musculature is required, so that the precise motions of peristalsis can be controlled and coordinated. The nerves also connect to organs in the head that sense pressure, texture, and various chemicals, and some annelids even have eyes. Although among these species that have eyes, most of them just have small, light-sensitive ocelli that can detect the general direction of light and dark. They can't form images or anything advanced like that. But in addition to those guys, just with the light-sensitive ocelli, some species actually do have compound eyes, and in other species, they have camera eyes. These more complex eye structures can probably form images, although the level of development, the level of sophistication that we see in these structures, these optical organs, is such that if they do form images, they are blurry and hazy and shady at best. They might be able to detect gross movement or objects overhead creating shade, but that's about it. It's really not an advanced sensory system. The annelids also possess immense ecological importance. While some species, like leeches, are potentially dangerous parasites and offer little else, other species, like earthworms, provide enormous ecological value by breaking down detritus, mixing nutrients into the soil, and by being food for all manner of larger animals, like vertebrates. Okay, so that's a quick summary of the worms of Spiralia. Now, let's shift over to the other protostome division, the Ecdysozoa. This group includes the well-known arthropods and all the tardigrades. Everything else in the Ecdysozoa clade is some kind of weird worm creature, so that's what we're going to explore now. One of the smallest and simplest of these are the Caenorhyncha, or the mud dragons. They're so named because they live in the mud and the sediment at the bottom of the ocean, and here they lurch around, digging for food, which can be either living stuff like diatoms, plankton, or other tiny critters, or they scavenge the marine snow, which is the littered organic material that falls to the ocean floor, from all of the predation, death, and excretion of everything swimming above. Although they have mouths, the Caenorhyncha can also absorb nutrients directly through their skin, although this only happens in areas not covered in a protective cuticle. So the cuticle is kind of like armor, and where the armor doesn't cover, that softer skin can absorb nutrients. These worms have simple bodies with 11 segments and rudimentary nervous systems with a ventral nerve cord and a ganglion ring at the head. The nerves connect to tiny bristles covering the body, which provide a sense of touch, and in some species, the nerves connect to a pair of tiny, simple eyes. Although the adults are no longer than a millimeter, they don't have cilia. Instead, they have long, pointy spines, which protrude from their tails, their sides, and their heads. The spines are used for movement, as the mud dragons can mount them against something and push off from them, or they can use their spines to grab something and pull their body towards it. Even their reproduction involves these spines, which are used to grab and anchor themselves to their mate, so that they can line up the sperm duct with the oviduct for the transfer of sperm to the egg. The female will then lay the fertilized egg and bury it in the mud. Closely related to the Caenorhyncha are the Priapulida, or the penis worms, which are named after their peachy, phallic appearance. Like their mud dragon cousins, the penis worms also live in the mud, although they grow to be much larger. The penis worms have a soft, cylindrical shape, with no vascular or respiratory systems. And despite being relatively large, they have a large internal body cavity that's filled with a fluid that keeps the tissues alive. This fluid includes blood, a hemerythrin pigment that's involved in respiration, and small amoeba-like cells that have an immunological function. The penis worms have a mouth lined with teeth, which feed into a simple, straight digestive tract that ends in an anus at the other end of the body. To remove fluid waste, they have weird pseudo-kidneys, or protonephridia, which look like feathery tufts protruding in pairs besides the anus. Their nervous system includes a ganglion ring and a nerve cord, but they don't have any specialized sensory structures. At most, they have touch-sensitive tissue around their mouth and bulging proboscis, so as to sense the mud they're digging around in and to identify potential food. But as far as sensory structures go, as far as an ability to sense the world and get neural feedback so that they can detect something, anything about their environment, that's about it. That's all they have, is that little touch-sensitive tissue around their mouth. Another ecdysozoa group is the nematodes. Ecologically speaking, the nematodes are kind of like the rotifers. They are incredibly tiny and incredibly diverse. They have a near global distribution. They've adapted to almost every niche you can think of, and as food, they're an important component of the base of the food web. It really can't be understated just how widespread and numerous the nematodes are. There's a mind-blowing quote that I love from nematologist Nathan Cobb that illustrates just how ever-present and ubiquitous the nematodes are. Mr. Cobb said, quote, "If all the matter in the universe except the nematodes were swept away, our world would still be dimly recognizable. And if, as disembodied spirits, we could then investigate it, we should find its mountains, hills, vales, rivers, lakes, and oceans represented by a film of nematodes. The location of towns would be decipherable, since, for every massing of human beings, there would be a corresponding massing of certain nematodes. Trees would still stand in ghostly rows representing our streets and highways. The location of various plants and animals would still be decipherable, and, had we sufficient knowledge, in many cases, even their species could be determined by an examination of their erstwhile nematode parasites." Unquote. What's kind of interesting about this is that, despite their unparalleled numerical dominance over every other form of macroscopic life, the nematodes are all pretty similar in appearance, and it's difficult, if not impossible, to visually determine the nematode species. Generally speaking, they're all very small worms, about 5 to 100 micrometers wide, and the largest species of nematode is no more than 1/8 of an inch long. Their head is a radially symmetrical mass lined with lips, which conceal small teeth that scrape for food. Some species have a stylet, or a small spear or knife-like structure in the mouth that the nematode uses to stab into its prey. Sometimes the stylet is hollow, and it can be used to suck out various fluids like a syringe. The nematodes have an outer cover of epidermis, below which runs peripheral nerve cords, The dorsal nerve controls movement, and the lateral nerves sense pressure and texture in the environment, and the ventral nerve is involved in both movement and sensation. And below the muscle lies a relatively simple linear intestinal tract, which leads to an anus at the rear of the body. Like many of the other worms mentioned so far, the nematodes are covered in small bristles, which help provide the sense of touch. They also have 2 clumps of highly innervated cells in their head that are believed to be chemoreceptor organs, like a combined nose-tongue structure, and some marine species have what are thought to be eye spots, or small clusters of cells with light-sensitive pigments. Closely related to the nematodes are the nematomorpha, also known as the horsehair worms or the Gordian worms. Morphologically, the nematomorphs are very similar to the nematodes, being long and thin with segmented bodies defined by gentle ridges and spines. But internally, the nematomorphs are very different and much more simple. They have no circulatory or respiratory organs. They don't have a complete gut. They don't have an anus or nephrons for removing waste. The nematomorphs only have one nerve cord running down their bodies, descending from a simple nerve ring near the head. Like the tapeworms, the nematomorphs are parasitic. The adults live in water environments where the males and females will mate by tangling up into knots of worm flesh. The female will then lay a gelatinous string of eggs, which get consumed by some unlucky animal. Once inside the digestive tract of their host, the eggs will hatch, and the developing larva will attach to the intestinal lining and directly absorb nutrients through their skin. After some months of growth in this intestinal tract, the larva will mature and leave the host to return to water. In some species, like the Spinochordides tallinii, they'll infect the brain of their grasshopper or cricket host and make the host seek water, where it will dive in and drown itself. This allows the parasitic nematomorph to steer its host to a place where it can engage in the next stage of its life cycle. Lastly, and the final divergence in the ecdysozoa before the tardigrades and arthropods emerged, are the onychophora, or the velvet worms. These are really fascinating creatures that look kind of like slugs or caterpillars. Unlike virtually every other kind of worm, the velvet worms have little baggy conical stub feet called oncopods or lobopods, which they use to walk around, much like a caterpillar does, although where caterpillars have an exoskeleton and hard, claw-like feet, the velvet worms are soft-bodied, and they use hydrostatic pressure to move their stubby appendages. Their soft skin is covered in touch-sensitive papillae and tiny scales, which gives them the velvety appearance and texture that they're named after. As the velvet worms are some of the largest organisms that I've talked about today, they have a complex internal anatomy with well-developed organ systems. They have insect-like trachea for breathing, which draw in air and distribute oxygen throughout the body via a kind of assisted diffusion. The internal body cavity is a hemocoel, or a cavity filled with blood, which surrounds and saturates all of the internal organs. The blood is circulated through a tube-shaped heart organ that beats with a diastole-systole mechanism, much like the hearts found in larger animals. The velvet worms also have a complex neural system, innervating chemoreceptors in the lips, as well as the eyes and even antennae. At the base of each leg, in the armpit so to speak, they have little wart-like pores that secrete pheromones. At the end of each leg, they have little feet equipped with a pair of retractable chitin claws, which are used for traction and stability. Similarly sharp structures are found in the mouth as jaws, which are surrounded by lips that take the form of a muscular protrusion coming out of the bottom of the head. Instead of chewing by moving the jaws up and down, the jaws slide forward and backward to slice and rip apart the prey. To catch their prey, which usually consists of small insects, the velvet worms are known to spray a milk-colored slime out of the glands on either side of the mouth. Within the glands, a muscle compresses a fluid sac, which forces the fluid towards the pore orifice. Surprisingly, the pore tissue is actually not stable or strong enough to deliberately control the direction of the stream of slime. So when you see a velvet worm spray the slime and it looks like it's coming out in this oscillating pattern that has pretty good surface area coverage, that's not intentional, it's not under deliberate control. Instead, the velvet worms have evolved to exploit the natural fluid physics at work here. This high surface area coverage that comes about from this oscillating spray, it increases the chance of successfully capturing a prey animal, so it has this evolutionary benefit in that it enhances the effect of their surprise attack. But the oscillation, like I said, it's not a controlled action or a deliberate strategy. It's a result of the physics of the viscous fluid slime passing through the pore during compression. In other words, it's the exact same phenomena as an uncontrolled fire hose, oscillating with the force of the exiting water. The velvet worm's slime is heavy and sticky, and it's usually quite successful in pinning down a prey insect. In effect, the velvet worm uses an ambush hunting strategy, where it quietly detects prey, usually by sneaking up on it and then gently brushing it with its antenna, so it can gauge its size, potential danger, any nutrient value it can derive from a prey animal of that size or shape. And once it's performed all these calculations, it'll engage this spraying slime ambush attack. This will immobilize the prey animal before it really even knows what's going on. This is advantageous because the velvet worm is really, really slow. If the prey animal gets away, the velvet worm won't pursue. It really can't pursue, so it will instead keep hunting. If the prey animal is hit by the slime and it happens to be caught up and trapped or immobilized, the velvet worm will then exhibit a fierce determination to track it down and eat it. Upon a successful entrapment, no matter what form it takes, the lumbering velvet worm will slowly examine the immobilized and doomed creature. As the prey animal isn't going anywhere, the velvet worm can take its time. It'll find a weak point in the body, like a crease between tergite plates or in the joint of a limb, and it'll puncture that soft tissue. Specialized saprophytic juices will be injected into the prey animal's body, which will begin to liquefy it from the inside out, starting at the point of puncture and injection. As the prey animal dies and internally liquefies, the velvet worm will roam around the nearby area, eating up all the slime it can find, to recover some of the nutrients it used to make it in the first place. Making slime is metabolically expensive, so the velvet worm wants a refund when it can get it. After a few minutes of slime ingestion, they'll come back to the still suffering but probably dead prey animal. Now, the velvet worms have a generalist carnivore diet. They'll eat anything they can catch, including insects, arachnids, millipedes and centipedes, slugs, snails, and other worms. Whatever can be trapped in the slime, even small vertebrates like tiny lizards or little frogs, anything that can be trapped in the slime and injected with these saprophytic gut-melting enzymes, they'll eat. Their slicing jaws will easily cut through the softened exoskeleton, and the juicified innards can be sucked out with a specialized pharynx organ. In species that exhibit social behaviors, or that hunt communally, the leading female will tend to have the first right to large prey items. Enjoying up to an hour to feed on her own, the leading female will eventually be joined by the other females. Male velvet worms come in to eat their share when the females are done. The whole hunting process begins in the late evening, typically after the sun has set. They'll hunt in the early nighttime and eat as much as they can until sunrise, when the threat of overheating or drying out in the sun will force them to abandon any meals in progress to return to the safety of the shade. And with that, I've come to the end of this gnarly episode on the world of worms. This was a crash course on the worms that really, honestly, just barely scratched the surface. To briefly review, we looked at the xenocoelomorphs, which predated the actual protostomes and deuterostomes. Among the true protostomes, in the Spiralia clade, we looked at the rotifers, which are small worms that live in virtually every habitat, everywhere. The spiny, hook-covered Chetognatha arrowworms that live in every marine habitat and exist as part of the plankton. the highly diverse flatworms, which includes everything from marine hunters to intestinal parasites, and the annelids, which have tremendous ecological value cycling nutrients and regenerating soils. In the ecdysozoa, we looked at the radically spiny Chinorhyncha, the mud dragons that burrow through the mud on the seafloor, or on the banks or the bed of a river. We looked at the Priapulida, the lumpy, flesh-colored carnivorous worms named after their phallic morphology. We looked at the nematodes, which have tremendous diversity and ecological distribution on par with the rotifers. We also looked at the closely related Nematomorpha, which are almost exclusively intestinal parasites of one kind or another. And lastly, we looked at the ponderous velvet worms, with their caterpillar-like body form and their ambush-style slime-spraying hunting strategy. Together, all of these worms represent a huge portion of the kingdom Animalia, and a massive, irreplaceable component of the eukaryotic food chain and the global ecosystem. They're involved in everything, both big and small, from geochemical cycling and sustaining soil-dependent habitats to infesting the guts and brains of host animals as part of their life cycle. I hope you enjoyed your tour through the world of worms, and I hope you're excited for the next episode in this series on protostomes, which will explore the biodiversity of the mollusk phylum. This will touch on everything from slugs and snails to squid and octopus, and it's going to be really weird and really interesting. Hit that subscribe button so that you can get that episode right when it drops. And if you enjoyed this episode, then hit that like button. Or if you're listening through the Apple Podcast app, then give it a 5-star rating. And as always, thanks for listening.